Last Sunday we spoke of those three disciplines, spiritual disciplines, to assist us during this period of the Christmas or Nativity fast. They were: do not resent, do not react, and cultivate inner stillness. This is precisely what St. Paul is telling us today, as in that section of his letter to the Ephesians from which we read. St. Paul urges us to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace, because there is one body, one Spirit, one Lord, one God. Paul's advice must be taken very literally and applied to the circumstances and to the difficulties of our daily lives. Otherwise, what good does it do to speak of our lofty ideas about unity in Christ or unity in the church if, first of all, we do not pay any attention whatsoever to safeguarding the unity of the Spirit and the bond of love in our own families, or with those with whom we live, or with those with whom professional or civic or economic life bring us into daily contact. This morning, let's look in some detail at this epistle reading from today's liturgy. In the preamble, in the first verse that we read today, the imprisoned Paul makes an appeal in which then serves to introduce all of the exhortations to follow. And he does this with a spectacular headline. And that headline is this: lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. He makes an allusion to his imprisonment. I think this serves two purposes. First of all, it makes the following admonitions very personal and urgent. And it also reminds his readers of the cost of discipleship. Discipleship is not easy. It's difficult. It's demanding and costly. Paul implores the Ephesians, and by extension you and I, to realize what it is you and I have been given, and then to be in practice what we are in Christ. So he turns the focus of his letter from what God has been giving us to what you and I are to do in response. How one believes must affect how one lives. Creed must influence conduct. And in biblical diction, the noun calling or vocation is never used in the plural. Paul knows of only one calling: to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And it's the same for all of his followers, however diverse the spiritual gifts that have been granted to all of us. Christ's call to come and follow him entrusts an individual with a high status and a correspondingly high responsibility and task. Paul then lists 4 virtues for us to cultivate. And interestingly, he lists them in the imperative, not as suggestions, but as imperatives. Humbleness, gentleness, patience, and forbearing love. Now, these 4 may not possibly be the ones that you would list as reflective of this high calling to which we are called, but they are exactly those which we need. Let's look at each one of them briefly. The Greek word that Paul uses for humbleness has the bad connotation from pre-Christian and later Greek writing of lacking self-respect. People think if you're humble, you're groveling on the ground and such. You have no self-respect. This is not the New Testament concept of humility. The followers of Christ are distinguished from others because they don't think quite so highly of themselves. St. John Chrysostom taught that humbleness presupposed a person's consciousness of being something great. Presupposed a consciousness of being a created individual, an individual created in the image of God and called to grow into that image and likeness. We are intended for relationship with God. And that's truly something great. Without God, we have no meaning. Humans are intended to be something great. But in the process of trying to become that something great, we often have become self-centered and self-seeking. And thus, we relive the plot of Genesis 3, the fall of Adam and Eve, every day. Our self-seeking evolves into jealousy and disparagement of others. Thus, the need for humbleness. Secondly, gentleness or meekness. In order to have gentleness, we have to renounce the harshness and the violence and the lack of caring, the lack of receptivity that we often meet in our world. And you and I, as followers of Christ, are to practice instead gentleness. Healthy relationships cannot exist under force or threat. Gentleness conveys a sensitivity, a desire not to harm, a valuing of the other person. With gentleness, people can be nurtured. Much emotional and sometimes physical damage is done within a context that should be most loving. For example, we can say that we didn't mean anything by the harsh and demeaning language we use when talking to another person. But that damage will have irreparably been done. Gentleness nurtures people, respects them, and allows them to drop the defenses and deal more objectively with situations. Patience. 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 In order to have patience, you and I have to renounce the tyranny of our own agendas. All of us have a sense of timing about when events should happen. And that sense of timing rarely agrees with anyone else's sense of timing. Our society has taught us to want it now and to get it now. The very rejection of that idea that you and I should have to wait on or for anyone or anything is merely another form of self-centeredness. A lack of patience reflects a narrowness of soul. Patience is the largeness that values other people enough to give them room to fail, to learn, and hopefully to develop. Patience is especially necessary in allowing people space to mature at their own rate, rather than to expect them to do everything right and to do it right now. St. Cyprian of Carthage writes these beautiful words about this passage. He writes, Paul shows that neither unity or peace can be maintained unless the brethren cherish each other with mutual forbearance and preserve the bond of harmony by means of patience. 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 And finally, forbearing one another in love. St. John Chrysostom beautifully interprets this as having a wide and big soul. The term love here is not a feeling or an emotion, but it's an act of the will. It exists only in relation to specific people, and it's always costly. Jesus loved us to the end, the scriptures tell us. And look what it cost him. St. Paul is telling us today that the love that you and I experience in Christ must be then extended to others. Love and forbearing one another are intertwined and mutually explanatory. Both are ways of valuing another person. In order to have such forbearing love, once again, you and I must renounce the self. Let us recognize that all of us are, at times, a burden and a pain. But we are bound to one another in Christ. In daily life, each encounter can lead to tensions, misunderstandings, conflicts of opinion, disputes, in which one person will feel superior to the other, one will feel more right than the other. And sadly, such personal conflicts are more acrimonious inside a community or inside a family than amongst outsiders. Note very carefully that Paul's commandment to love here aims at love for fellow believers who are a problem and cause trouble for others. That the fellow human being to be loved is potentially or actually is a burden is a given. Otherwise, Paul would not have spoken of forbearing them in love. And our love for them is to resemble the love that Christ has for each and every one of us. It is to be unselfish, not calculating or expecting any gain from it. It is to be forgiving, outgoing, self-deliberate. And the neighbor, the person, even the one who is a burden, and whose character and behavior often prove cumbersome, is much more than just an occasion or a test of love. He or she, and it's always a specific man, woman, child, relative, stranger. These are the very material of love. For love does not exist in a vacuum. Love is always love of this or of that individual. Love here and now. Love shown under ever new conditions in ever original forms. Where there is love, there this or that person in their uniqueness is forborne and fully accepted. Lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. This should be our job description, our goal for this week of the Nativity Fast. Let's all try practicing those 4 virtues. Humbleness, gentleness, patience, and forbearing others